we are putting organizations like this in a very bad light when they have created a much better system, a much better economy for the Philippines, basically. Without this conglomerate, I would see that a lot of things would fall through. And if we really think about how economics works, no one's forcing a business. No one's forcing you to give your money to a business. You're giving your money to a business because you're getting a service or a product that you and yourself wanted to get. It, all right, we got an interesting topic today, and we are covering basically the healthcare of the Philippines. The reason that I wanted to bring this up, it's actually fascinating. A coworker was the one who brought this up and showed this video. And if you look at the dateline of the video that Bloomberg showed about the detainment of patients in the Philippines, if they're not able to pay, that was posted on February. So just very recently, February of this year. And when my coworker showed that, he's like, yeah, you guys detain your patients, and like this hospital is owned by a conglomerate of a company you covered. Like
Hmm.
that is very interesting. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Which I didn't get until I watched it. And I sent it to you, and I was like, what were your thoughts on it? I guess like I think you watched the bits and pieces of it. What are your thoughts on it? And you were here and experienced a bit of Philippine healthcare. I guess you were younger and you've heard the opinions of other Filipinos who came to the U.S. What's your take on it, and what are some thoughts you have in mind?
Yeah. Well, I think that in regards to healthcare, I mean, it is a pretty lucrative industry. At the same time, how do you balance the empathy of trying to help those in need, what at the same time recognizing that there comes a cost to healthcare? I mean, if it's a private hospital, my position on it is, I mean, they're for profit. They need to kind of keep the lights on. So they have certain limitations on what they can or can't do. But if it's government funded, and I'm sure a lot of hospitals are, there needs to be a level of like accommodation. And from this one, right, I'm pretty sure it's a private hospital. And so this is the kind of the question comes with, how should the hospital be reimbursed for helping those people? And I'm just going to address that question and not the moral question on it. And I think it makes sense that the hospital is going to be trying to recoup that cost if people went to them for a particular service, and supposedly they could pay. Then the hospital, it was expecting that, and now they're trying to detain uh, patients because those patients are unable to pay the expected services. And to me, maybe they don't need to necessarily detain them, but I mean, there needs to be some sort of contract work, something that can hold both parties accountable, where the patient expected to get healthier or better, and that the hospital did its due diligence to helping those people. At the same time, yeah, and so they shouldn't necessarily detain them, but they do need to be duly compensated for their
Right.
work. And I mean,
Right.
I don't think this position is necessarily like outrageous. I think it's very basic and common that if you're gonna, I mean, um, this is healthcare in which there are so many different nuances on what people need, things like that. But at the same time, like, it's that recognition that you can't expect a service for free. I
Mm.
don't think I think people that live in the real world recognize that there's a cost to things, and there are a lot of things that are unfair, such as being born with certain disabilities or
Right.
cognitive issues. And like, the way to do it is not like, okay, it's unfair, so then like now make everything free. So like, at the system that the Filipino people are living at that time, that's the expectation that they are expected to pay. Or am I wrong on this?
Right, no, that's actually correct. There's the law that you mentioned, 99439, I believe, was the Republic Act 99439, or the Hospital Detainment Act. It's basically a law that says you cannot detain patients, but there are two exceptions to it. I did like the way that Bloomberg phrased it, because they phrase it as loopholes for these two exceptions. The number one exception to this rule, let me explain it first. The rule basically states that you cannot detain these patients once that they've recovered, and that a doctor or a nurse has basically signed off and says that you have fully recovered and that you're free to go. You have your walk away date, and then there's two exceptions to it. Number one, which says you cannot detain a patient unless uh, they ordered a private room, or they are in a private room. And number two is if they did not sign a promissory note. And a promissory note is kind of like, it's similar to a bank. It's similar to getting a bank loan, where you have to have someone who is authorized and says, okay, this person has the capabilities to meet the terms of this loan, and also that you have collateral that you are putting up, so that there's some sort of deposit, maybe cash, maybe any other type of asset that you choose to put up. Now, the reason I didn't like the way that Bloomberg phrased it as loopholes is because these are fairly reasonable if you really think about the nature of if you really think about the nature of people. Like, people are inherently kind, but
Oh,
you
I
really can't
disagree with
ignore the
that.
fact.
Sorry, Chris. I'm just
Yeah.
interrupting for you. The moment you said that people are inherently kind, we have a similar like religious background, but I actually would disagree with that. And I think, sorry, like this is just a nitpick. Maybe you're gonna
Right.
correct, or you're gonna say some things to provide more nuance on it. But to say that, I think is to kind of just look back in history and recognize, like, yo, people's been killing people left and right. There's
I
been
was
so
getting
many
actually there.
wars. I don't
The
think
people
it's
are in here.
I
No,
don't think
no.
people are inherently kind. Rather, that people are, um, like life is what is it? Oh my gosh, from Thomas Hobbes. Life is like short and brutish, and so people are inclined to do what is best for their self interest, and that would, generally speaking, in a world that is more tame now, to be kind to one's neighbor, because you want allies in wherever you are.
The reason I say inherently kind is because, when you're born, you kind of have that conscience within you, like whenever you start out. But there's a but to that, and that is,
A big but.
people have the potential for great evil as well, and it really depends on the choices that you make. So, the reason I put that out there is because we want to believe, and there's a subconscious parts of us that believe that people are kind and the world is nice, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that people have the potential for evil, and that is to cheat the system. The reason those two loopholes, as Bloomberg would call it, I'd call it, like, kind of like security measures. The reason their security measures are there in that act is to, number one, prevent people from demanding service in a private room with where they do not have the capacity to pay. If people have the option to get a private room, which is more often than not because they want to have some privacy, they want to have the feeling of luxury, whatever the reason is, they're going to go for that. And so that's why that rule was in place, that they shouldn't have a private room.
Yeah.
The other security measure there was that they need to have a promissory note, because, like you said earlier, these hospitals, these private organizations, need to be able to survive. They need to be able to exist long term. They need to have a way of guaranteeing that these patients, whenever they receive the medical care that the hospitals, that these people are going through, they are working so hard to make the healthcare system. And mind you, the healthcare system is much better because of these private organizations, because they're the ones who do the research, they're the ones who do the investments, and they're the ones who put up basically with the risk. in order to better determine how to forward healthcare. And so it becomes so hard that we demonize private institutions because they don't give out the needs of people such as healthcare. If we go back to the basic rights of people, uh, we need to understand three things. Basic human rights of people is basically to life, liberty, and property. Your own life, your own liberty, and your own property. It is not to have your needs are not rights, because if your needs are rights, then that would force other people, other organizations to work for you. And I remember there was this quote that you said a while ago where Milton Friedman says that everyone, if needs were rights, then everyone would have their needs if everyone has a house, food, and two servants, which
Oh,
yeah, yeah, which is basic ironic in itself. And I was reading some comments of people on Reddit because there was a very huge debate online about healthcare, and you see a lot of people. It's really hard to side with private institutions without empathy, and it's really hard to get on to propose a solution when people do not have a basic understanding of economics, do not have a basic understanding of how organizations need to function, and even how governments need to function. Everyone is saying that there should be this good thing that needs to exist, but no one talks about how this good thing is to be accomplished. What are the resources? What are the sacrifices? What are the things that need to be put in place? And that is a very frustrating conversation to have to read through that, because once you
yeah.
understand that there needs to be private institutions, once you understand that these institutions are here to help, people then keep blaming the government. Why isn't the government doing about
Oh,
healthcare? Well, here's the thing: even if government did help, I don't think they realize that the capacity that government can help is also very limited. It's not going to provide this idealistic image of what healthcare will be. Even if government does step in, there's only so much that a government can do, especially in a third world country with very limited resources, even in a utopian society.
yeah. Well, I think part of it also is just the idea that it sounds good. Everybody deserves to be healthy and live a long life. Now, with that statement, who in the world is going to be against that? Nobody is against that. Now, separating that statement to reality, part of it is okay, everybody deserves those things. Now, who is going to pay? Who is going to make that happen? It's so easy for people to kind of say the government, because the government has, when we think about government, we don't really put a certain face on it. It's just kind of a conglomerate of a bunch of of this mysterious entity that just has a bunch of money. But we
Right.
forget that the government is only really able to exist in the way that it does through taxes, through the way that it receives money. Like, if the government is going to be providing those services, it means that it would have to tax the people. And I think from you're kind of reading from Reddit, which is leans a certain way in terms of their policies and thinking. And I think part of it is like they're not really recognizing the reality, as well as the the, the theft that would entail if everybody deserved those things. Sure, I don't think anybody deserves anything per se, but like if everybody should get free healthcare or free housing, free food, somebody has to provide for that. And if people are willing, and part of it is also it needs to be voluntarily. I think about those hospitals, and we hear about that like particular story, but I'm also sure that there are going to be some doctors and people that work in healthcare that got into it because it's a lucrative career, and there's going to be some people as well that got into those industries to genuinely help people. And now this is where pro bono work kind of comes in, where there's a lot of organizations out there that are actually, they recognize that there is a cost, but then because they've been successful in the past, or like the way the business model works, they're able to provide those services at a much cheaper rate. And somebody had to pay for those. So like in some way or another, it was paid but maybe not in a way that is like necessarily dollar value, or like it's just been paid. It's the service has been created to for those specific kind of people. Now, I just think back on how going to Reddit to kind of read some of those comments that are probably liked. I think I went to the same kind of rabbit hole as you, and it's really interesting to see people's premises just completely, like, their premises themselves aren't built in solid foundation. It's the idea, like, it sounds really good to do that, but then you got to recognize somebody has to provide it, and then nobody really wants to think about that. People just think about the government as if the government just magically has money. And I think we kind of got to remember, even though like the Philippines is like different from the United States, I'm sure it's the same, very similar way the government kind of just grew. Back in the day in the United States, there wasn't the government wasn't as strong as it is now. What took care of you was primarily first your family, and outside your family is going to be your community. And part of that community is if you go to church, your church members are going to help you out. In, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is the Bishop's Storehouse, in which the community members are trying to be as self-sufficient as possible, but we recognize that there are moments in which we might not be self-reliant for a period of time, and that's when we can get assistance. In this case, assistance of church members through their tithes, through their resources that you then have the necessities that you can to be able to eventually stand up and help yourself. And as a church member, you're more than willing to do a voluntary tithe. While on the other hand, with the government, because you don't really see a face, or you don't really necessarily view the people that gave in to that system as people that you don't want to be a burden to, it becomes easier to just take advantage of the system and not pay your fair share, let's say. And that's what I think is happening with the hospital issue. I think there's just like, how do you balance something like that, where the hospital, in this case, it sounds like it's a for-profit. How should they get their money? And I mean, it just sounds like there needs to be a promissory note, like you said. But at the same time, there is that risk that people are going to walk. But that's just the business of that's just a business risk that inherently comes from doing business.
This is actually interesting that you pointed out the patient or the promissory note thing. When I read into the background stories of these individuals, it basically was that all they had to do was sign a promissory note, and to get those things in order. The video that we showcased, and it's kind of frustrating because this is the video that's circulating around Filipinos that's creating this false belief that this institution is basically an evil institution that withholds its patients, and that any private institution is going to do that. Well, my first response would be, okay, if you think private institutions are evil, don't go for healthcare in a private institution. Go to a public hospital and run the risk, run the other risk there, which is basically you may or may not be attended to because of the numerous number of people that is going for this free healthcare, which the government has with their limited funds and their limited capabilities. The other thing that is very interesting is that once this promissory note was signed, basically they are free to go. We are putting organizations like this in a very bad light when they have created a much better system, a much better economy for the Philippines, basically. Without this conglomerate, I would see that a lot of things would fall through. And if we really think about how economics works, no one's forcing a business. No one's forcing you to give your money to a business. You're giving your money to a business because you're getting a service or a product that you and yourself wanted to get. It's tit for tat. There is no party here that is getting that is getting so much more. The reason that they grew this big is because they were so good at that they were able to get more in return, and they were able to economize or put this in such a scale that would increase the number of people that are giving them that would are requiring their services. The other thing that I don't like about this video is that it is painting Ayala as like the worst of all of these institutions, and that they're treating patients like prisoners, when Ayala has been so generous. The ACI healthcare has been so generous because a promissory note would require you to put collateral and a co-guarantor, when Ayala or ACI Health in a lot of cases would forego collateral. All you would have to do is have a co-guarantor. You don't even have to put up a deposit. And we
Well,
keep
it
and
kind of
I
just this is sounding as if the people that are most frustrated with this is that they want healthcare to be free. I think from just the sound of it, it's they feel like healthcare is a moral right, and and so it shouldn't even be a cost. And once again, I think we've already established this, but everything has a cost. There's a trade off, and it's just easier, and it sounds more popular, to give, to be in that giving mindset than in the taking mindset, and it sounds more empathetic, and it's probably going to give you some like brownie points, it seems like, in social medias. But then when you go into the nitty gritty of the reality of it, it's like all the people that are saying that, yeah, it should be free, like, are you then willing to, you yourselves, be willing to have like an additional 15-20% tax on yourself? It's that kind of thing where it needs to come voluntarily. And like you said, it's more than anything, it just comes down from that moral issue. And I think once that's addressed, and like people can actually just say what they are thinking on that particular issue, like they can just get a co-guarantor. But what happens if they can't? Like, let's look at it from the worst scenario. Well, what do you think a patient or the hospital should be doing if who they took care of really cannot pay for it, and like there's like no hope? What should happen? How should this be rectified? How can justice and mercy be filled in this case?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question because I really haven't gone deep into the research of seeing how people will result that if they don't have the financial capabilities. I've yet to see a case where they weren't able to sign a promissory note, and then again, seeing that Ayala or ACI Health was already reaching out an olive branch where you don't have to. In some cases, in some very special cases, when they really look at the individual, and it's like not a general rule. It's basically a case by case scenario where you don't have to put up with the collateral because of financial stress, and their focus is really trying to get paid back at and probably at the lowest interest possible, and so they would try and work these situations out. It's just that people aren't financially literate, that they immediately see interest and anything that adds up to their bill as financially stressing.
Yeah.
When if
Well,
they yeah if they were a little more literate, they would be able to understand, oh, this company's actually reaching out on olive branch, and they keep thinking that the default should be there should be no collateral at all. That should be the standard, when in fact the reality is the default should have been you pay this bill up front. The fact that they're giving you a promissory note or a kind of loan with some
mhm.
type of collateral or no collateral at all is already something very generous on their end, because again, if you don't do that, you're going to create a scenario where every other private, it's sending a message to private organizations that we're going to treat you unfairly in this country. And what will happen in the worst case scenario, if we go heavily on what the patient or consumer wants, we are saying to private organizations that your business of healthcare here is, it's basically against you. It's not worth the risk. And these private institutions will likely stop putting up private healthcare organizations. and we'd be stuck with public healthcare, and that would much worsen the situation that we are already in. But that's the
Yeah.
scenario that other people don't see, and it's some Reddit users are able to see that. Thankfully, some people who commented it, and some people who
As
I
a
talked to in
surprise.
real life. Yeah, which is great. I'd like to connect with these people and say, okay, I'm glad that you hear that, and we don't seem to be able to understand it. There's not enough people who understand the system very well, and we're having to put up with more news organizations that are putting up these biases, these this misinformation without doing they claim they do their research. It's not even proper research. They're heavily biased on the consumer side, and because they need to be empathetic, they need to generate these false news. Stop thinking that news outlets are in the business of bringing out factual news. We've learned from so many mistakes before that that's not their business. They sell you on bad news and bad information that gets you to react. That is their main purpose. Stop thinking to them as the seekers of truth. Think of them more critically as trying to sell you information that you would digest and have people like Sean and I here and multiple other people react to how this message is being perceived and how it would basically get the general consensus, get the general population to say, hey, I seen this article. They're in the business of selling you attention. They're not in the business of selling you truth.
Sure, but okay, so I'm gonna push back on this a little bit. So then, how, with so much misinformation out there in the social medias and things being put into your stories and your so what you'll see in your particular social medias, how should you be able to disseminate like what is true and what is not? I mean, you were mentioning that there's a lot of like things in social media aren't going to be true, but then if so much stuff out there are not true, then how can one figure out what is true?
People have to use this thing that I love to call common sense.
Common sense, but
And
Thomas Paine, I'm pretty sure it's Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine once said the really popular quote, like, common sense is not so common. And especially, like, I can excuse people of our age, which had a time where uh, there was, it wasn't as prevalent, I would argue, and we were able to better like see what is, for example, like AI videos or
good.
certain articles that are just so deranged that you're gonna kind of look at it sideways. But how would people that are younger, who have been growing up in the AI realm, how should they kind of recognize what is true and what isn't? Because their whole lives, it's their social medias have been curated for potentially what they need to see, or maybe there's rage
Right.
bait. Because I'm trying to put myself into that situation, and then it kind of, the reason why I feel like I'm better able to recognize what is true and what's not is because I lived a life where my life wasn't as connected with the social medias, and I've been able to kind of interact with people in a normal setting, let's say, where they don't need to act out or anything like that for clout. And now I feel like there's a lot more of that pressure to act out in a certain way or to have an article in a more edgy term, like
Right.
edgy writing. So, like, what's the solution for the younger people or even the older people who's now like just getting into everything? It's like,
Right.
well, I have to assume that what's out there is kind of true, because like why would somebody put something else out there that's false?
Right. I think the very interesting thing to do is what I asked. It's interesting that you were asking that because I asked a friend of mine, or a friend of ours, rather, someone we both know, that we what will you do in trying to disseminate truth? And it's interesting. His response is, number one, you definitely got to fact check. You got to look at, and and you have to look at fact checkers, and then you also have to look at the platform, the reputation of your platform. Which side are they usually leaning to? Are they leaning more towards the empathy side, towards the mercy side, or do they also have some sense of justice and fairness to them? And after you look at the platform, you got to do your own research. and you draw conclusions, but also accept that these conclusions are more of hypotheses and that you could possibly be wrong as well. It's understanding, it's having an open mind that's saying, okay, I believe firmly in this, but I also have the understanding that I could be wrong. And if people are able to, there's also the need to have sound arguments where
Mm-hmm.
you come in and saying, okay, these are the facts that I have. This is my argument, and this is my basis for it. And coming to it with an open mind is being able to listen to what the other person has to say. It's seeing the straw man in their argument, but also seeing the steel man in their argument, and being able to accept maybe that there are some things that you could possibly be doing wrong. And that's what I see as healthy for if you're going to go into this realm of trying to understand truth. Professor Gibson, he is the business law teacher for BYU Hawaii a couple semesters ago, and while I was teaching, one of the last things that he said is to always seek for truth, and most of the times that truth is not going to be what you perceive it to be. And
Yeah.
that hit very deeply because we want to, it can't just be our version of truth looking at our facts. We also have to recognize that these social platforms, they're tailored to get our attention, and so they'll
Mhm.
constantly show you things that you agree with. It's going to be hard to see the things that you don't, but you got to sit there and take it and see, okay,
Why
yeah,
do
you
they
got to
have to
sit
take it?
you got to
I
sit
mean,
there and take it just so you can see the flaws in your argument, the flaws in your logic, and to stay
well,
within the lines.
it's I think what you're saying sounds good, but it's also too idealized. And what I mean by that is that I mean I get it, right? If you want truth, it takes time and effort and humility to recognize what is false and what is true. Now, with that being said, doing your own research, like you were saying, it takes a lot of time. And what we've recognized is life is complicated. Life is really complicated. We want shortcuts in life. We kind of want things to be told like the highlights. Even now in sports, in almost every sport, people aren't necessarily watching the sport; they're watching highlights of the sport. In terms of like what we're learning in schools, like there's AI now kind of highlighting certain things. So searching for the truth isn't ideal, and it's especially difficult if you yourself is the person to regulate that you could be wrong, and so you are willingly gonna look at something that is counter to your worldview. Like, I mean, I think this is why uh, people like flat earthers exist. Uh, I mean, it's so much easier to have that bubble. But then, like my the thing that I'm kind of having a hard time to grasp with like talking to you about this is like how can those people be reached? I mean, flat earthers or people that maybe believe certain things that might be a little off, and at the same time it could be off for us at the current moment, but then maybe in the future it's actually very much prevalent. I mean, an example of this of recent days, I think probably COVID-19. And so you know how COVID-19, we didn't know in the United States, they were saying we didn't know where it came from. We didn't know where it came from. And some people were saying, well, it came from China. It came from a laboratory in Wuhan. And at the time, those people were being censored as well. And now it's a lot more acceptable, I guess, that is the current ongoing theory of what probably did happen. And, not to be like politically incorrect, but like more than likely that is what happened. And so, and even me saying that, for example, even though it's not 1000% confirmed because there's so many different political pieces playing, it's like, I think it just makes sense that it's not some natural occurring thing. It probably was this natural occurring thing that was boosted up because of all these different man-made steroids that we put into the virus itself. To me, like, that makes more sense. But who knows down the line where maybe it's even more obvious on what something is. I mean, there's all these censorships things happening with Facebook, and so it becomes difficult to figure out what is true. And so, and like part of it is also like, so what if they don't believe the truth? What's so wrong about that? What's so wrong about that kind of thinking? What do you think?
So your question, if I understood it right, is how to coexist with people who don't believe in the
Oh
same
no, no,
beliefs that you
not
have.
quite. Something similar, but let's say going back to the hospital example,
Okay.
um, a lot of people just simply misunderstand what the hospital is doing. It seems as though there's a lot of it, like they want it on their books. What it sounds like, they want it on their books, so that, and then they're gonna have to write it off. To go back to like that question previously, what's going to happen if people cannot pay it? They can't pay it. Like seriously, that's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the
Right.
hospital, as a business, they're going to have to write it off. It's called a bad check. It
Right.
happens. As you know, it's not a great thing. And kind of just put in to a different example. Let's say, so in this case, it's a little bit different. Let's say like a car. You tried to buy a car. You have your monthly payments, but then you could no longer afford that car. What's going to happen is that car company is going to take that car, so you no
Right.
longer have it, and like you might be a little bit on the hook. But in this case, like, they can't take back, like maybe what they fixed with you, but they're going to have to say that it's a bad check. It's almost as if they took you
Right.
in expecting you to pay, but then unfortunately you did not pay. So it's bad for you and bad for them because you have something considered bad debt.
Right.
And I mean, there should be some sort of thing in the
There
Philippines.
is.
In the United States, we have something called a credit score. uh, but like, so to show your credit worthiness.
Right.
But in the case like in the Philippines, there should be some negative thing that um, is trying to incentivize you not to do that, right? Because like, why? If that's the case, and somebody there should get very, very sick, get as much benefits as possible than just debt, because like there's nothing. But in the case of a normal society, what's happening is like, so you could, like, for example, you could screw somebody or an organization off one time, but then it's going to be very difficult to do it again and again, especially when, in this case, your reputation will precede you. In the case of the United States, the credit score
Credit score.
is your
Right.
reputation. um, and I mean, there should be something in the Philippines. So that's what's going to happen. So it's bad for both companies, but ideally, that's not going to happen. If anything, what's going to happen is the hospital's like, we understand that, like, we fixed your broken leg. We're not going to break your leg again because you did pay us. Rather, we're going to say like, okay, the price was, let's say, is like $1,000 or whatever the number is. Just pay
Okay.
us a fifth of that. Because they want at least something. They want, it's better to have something than nothing. And so that's just like how
Mm.
business works. And if you look at it from a business perspective, a lot of hospitals would, I preferably not do that, but if the worst comes to worst, get something out of nothing.
That's basically the best case scenario that they're going to get, and hopefully it doesn't even have to come to that again. The when you pointed it out, I'm really thinking that these institutions are being more than generous, and people don't realize that their term, the consumer's fare of fair, is very different from an institution's term of fair.
Well,
And
with that said, sorry, I just wanted to interrupt a little bit. Like, with that said, like, it doesn't mean that there aren't bad institutions. There are bad institutions. Uh, it just comes down to a case by case basis.
right,
I mean, in this particular case, it sounds like
it wasn't,
they're,
and
yeah.
they and like that's the thing, like people need to understand before you can make the judgment of what a bad. And I really think that especially in this modern age when there's so many regulations, and there's so many good businesses out there. If a business has existed for maybe 20 years, being stretching this out, if your business has existed for more than 20 years, it's most likely that you're a good business, because if you're a bad business, your
I
reputation will
disagree.
again precede you. Like that's stretching it, right? Like if you were a bad business, there's really a unlikelihood that you would be able to survive that long because people would
Oh
not
yeah,
want to go to you for a service. If and by definition of a bad business, meaning you are only getting something without giving anything back.
yeah. Well, it depends on the value, and I think it comes back to like normal capitalism. If somebody is willing to pay you 100, like whatever the number is, but I'm just gonna
Right.
make some basic math here. If somebody's willing to pay you $100, and that means that they value your service or good more than $100. If not, they would not be selling it at that price. And like this could be for anything absurd. This could be with art. If somebody has a drawing, and sometimes we see these things where in the headlines where something that looks like it was drawn from a kindergartner is being sold for like $100 million. To me, that's really sus. But if somebody is literally willing to pay that much for that, I mean, who am I to stop him or her? And this is the same thing with like in those services. And I think there's a lot of services out there that we could say is objectively bad, or it does not provide
Mhm.
service. Yet people, like, this is where the individual accountability comes in. I think we can all agree. I don't know if I want to. So like we can all agree that. Okay, sorry. I don't want to go into this particular topic. Maybe
Careful
we'll,
there.
we'll save it for next week. Like for example, I think there was the issue with iPhones in Europe, in which the EU was telling Apple that they need to have their um, like the bottom part of the phone for the charging. It needs to be it needs to be a
USB-C.
USB-C, or
Yeah.
and not the lightning cable or whatever the proprietary thing that Apple has. They need to do that, or the EU will have a tariff on Apple. And like, to me, that sounds like government overreach, because
Mhm.
like that's almost telling this really smart company, no matter how you feel about them, like there's a reason why they got to like $1 trillion like speculative market. There's a reason why Apple got to the way it is, that it is one of the most well-known brands. And now it's almost like that phone market, that phone company, is being told by this non-phone company what they need to do so that
Right.
it can be considered fair. And see, that becomes an issue because like they're being forced, not necessarily forced, they're being strong-armed, because if they don't do that, then they'll have a tariff on them. And so Apple, I think, did the math on it, in which it is better to appease the EU government than to pay those extra taxes and tariffs
Right.
on their phones. And in some ways, some people could say, yeah, that's awesome, because the USB-C is more common. It's faster. Objectively, it's faster. It's this and that. But that's not the point. The point was a private company was strong-armed to do something, even though it got successful through its walled garden, let's call it,
Mhm.
on doing its things, being proprietary in a lot of items, a lot of uh, like things inside their phone. And now because of that, like they're being cheered. And so what's going to happen moving forward? Now it sounds good at the moment, but then there's going to be a lot of things that's going to make all these different companies like more, they're different in different ways. Now they're going to have to be more uniform depending on a government that's telling them what to do, even though that government is not the one, it's not their own money at stake, right?
You opened the door to a very interesting conversation about government overreach, and you mentioned how the regulation that the European Union,
The EU, yeah.
the
Like they're
EU,
like
uh,
they're almost like the government for the general European countries to make things
Okay.
fair.
Okay.
They're like the United
I'm
States, but the United European countries, let's say.
okay. So putting that into perspective, there's this thing in law that we call a slippery slope, which is if you open one door that says a government can do this, then what's going to stop a government from doing these other things? And that's another thing that I think the Philippine government has been very, very careful about, especially with its law on hospital detention. I think hospital detention in itself, and saying how you should do it is already some type of government overreach. But that there was still, I would argue that there was still a way to stop it in the sense that they put in security measures in place to, number one, prevent cheaters from getting a free pass using the system, and number two, to really ensure that these institutions are going to be paid back. Because again, going back to Reddit and how there were a lot of comments there that says government should step in to do this and to do that and to put in laws that prevent this from happening. The idea is that it's not as easy as people think. You can't just pass a law that says okay, you can do this on this basis, because there are going to be people with the capacity to do evil who will stretch that law and open other doors that could cause other harms. And that's why it's very important to consider the long-term consequences of said laws and said regulations, because while you may not be paying for the short-term consequence of such law and you're getting the short-term benefits, there is going to be a long-term consequence that's going to affect future generations and even you as you get older. I think it's very uncivil, like, to focus on to focus on the short-term benefits that you are going to reap and then have the next generation suffer for it. There are so many laws and there's so many regulations, so many policies that were set 50 to 100, 200 years ago that we are now paying the price for, because and the people who really benefited from that were basically boomers and people who passed away and didn't reap the long-term consequences, and now we're going to have to face all the muck and all the dirt and all the garbage that comes with these laws. And it's something that we really have to keep in mind whenever we are setting these laws. And once you understand that, you have a better understanding that even if you have a non-corrupt government, it cannot just function in a way that you would want it to function, because there there are things that you cannot see, that you cannot comprehend. And that's why it's so hard to be a politician who is reasonable and
Well,
future forward looking.
yeah, I would agree to that. And I think part of it is we got to remember the incentives. I think incentives is the most important thing, like to just logically think about how the world is happening. In regards to like politicians, their incentives is not to look good necessarily 100 years from now, 50 years from now. In a lot of cases, a lot of politicians are content with just simply winning the next election. So people would say certain things that are popular um, to get those votes. And so what's going to happen is like you were mentioning, maybe a short-term vision is for the short-term vision is going to be a trade-off for like the long-term one. But then the long-term one, those particular politicians aren't as affected by, or they're not even going to see it, or maybe they're older, and so there's not going to be a big thing. And also part of it is like, but who's really going to be at fault? Sometimes I like to think about this, where the politicians, generally speaking, if it's a fair election, is a reflection of what the people want. And an example of this that I'm thinking of is just how, like, with the new presidency with Donald Trump, I mean, right now he's really focused on the economy. Yet at this very moment, on the day of March 9, 2025, the economy is in a downturn. Yet I feel very strongly that in a year or two, it's going to be a lot better. Like we're going to like approach record highs just because there's all these other international companies that are investing in the United States. So it's
Right.
almost like a 1 year of transition, and then like one step backward, one step of preparation, let's say, and then oh, sorry about that. We had a couple of technical difficulties on my end.
Yeah.
But kind of reiterating what was being said, with the incentives of politicians, um, and the fault kind of comes into recognizing what the people kind of wanted. If everybody wanted, full free stuff, part of that want needs to kind of recognize the trade-off of what's going to require. It's going to require taxes to be increased 3, 4, 5, 6-fold. Maybe a couple freedoms to be kind of given up. And so these little trade-offs, these big trade-offs, it requires the people to better recognize that, and to choose better leaders. I mean, it kind of makes me think like, whose fault is it really? Is it the blind leading the blind, or is it the blind following the blind person, like the blind man? I don't know. It comes down to me, generally speaking, it's just easier and better to be as accountable as you can with everything that goes on with your life. And because you take accountability, because it is your fault, you are able to change something about yourself to have a different impact, different outcome.
And to kind of meddle in there on what you said about choosing better leaders, we need to fix our definition of what better leaders are. They're better leaders is not necessarily people who would do what you would want them to do to achieve a very lofty idealistic goal, because we have to accept that there are real challenges that would prevent us from going there, and that it may not even be as desirable when you really go into the muck of it. The good leaders are not going to be choosing the ones that you will want all the time. It's going to recognize that good leaders are going to put in place policies that are going to allow the best outcome for everyone and not for just one particular group. I don't like it how we're phrasing government. For so long, there are so many things that the Philippine government has been doing right for institutions to grow, and because they were trying to help encouraging these institutions to grow, they were able to make everything better for everyone. And that's something that we are very ignorant to. We can't just side with the people.
Mm,
We can't just side for the things that people want without having to work and pay the price for it. We have to
yes.
be able to put good leaders that understand that there is a cost to everything, but will also focus on the long term benefits. And that includes making a couple of hard decisions that we're not going to be in favorable of. It's
Well,
going to be very hard to do that because, like you said, everyone's just focused on the next election. Everyone's just focused on what they want to get in the short term because, again, they're not paying
well,
the price for the long term cost of it.
kind of like a counter to that though is, I don't want to I don't want to be getting my high horse and be like, I know better than these politicians, because there's so many different nuances, and the general idea should be that people are selfish, and
Mhm.
through that selfishness, they want better for themselves, for their
Right.
families, and then from there it extends better for their communities, and country, and then for the world.
Right.
And with that being said, uh, there should be like inclinations that improves people's well-beings, and it has been happening. To be honest, it has been happening. If I mean, not even the United States. If you compare the Philippines from 20 years ago, it's much better than 20 years ago. I challenge anybody who's even in the, what is it, the golden days of Marcos, I think, like that time period on when the Philippines at one point was like the number one economic powerhouse of Asia. Like imagine that. Well, whatever that time period is, compared that to the Philippines at this very moment, maybe comparatively it's not as good, but there has been a lot of progress. Like, and it does exist. And I think it's putting that into perspective. And if you look at a longer time horizon, I mean, this already happens in the United States, in which even the poorest person in the United States, objectively speaking, is living richer than the kings of like the 1700s. And we might not have a castle and the power to wield like to move armies, but we have plumbing. We have electricity. We have light. I'm looking at this through this like laptop, or there's monitors. I think even the kings and like the royalty would probably, like, if they could trade a lot, like their lives for like any one of ours, like they would gladly take this. And if you look at it from a longer time horizon, just be recognize the time period that we're living in and be grateful for it. But that doesn't mean that our issues aren't valid. They are valid, but we have to look at it at a more positive light, I would say. But with that said, I mean, there's so many different issues that needs to be tackled, and I think it needs to be. It's just like any really good business. You just got to focus on one thing, or like even in your life. And let's say there's 3 attributes in life. Let's say there's the physical, the mental, and the economical, let's say. I mean, and then let's say spiritual as well, but let's leave that out for now. But if you focus, like if the 3 cores of life are these 3, physical, mental, economics, all right, spiritual, let's say, these are the 3 pillars. If you focus on even one, like you go gung-ho in all your attributes, let's say in physical, all these other 2 are going to improve greatly as well. Or you improve your mental, these other 2 are going to improve greatly as well. Like ideally we want everything to grow at almost like the same pace, but realistically, we as people, we as human beings, we're really good at focusing on one thing and then solving a problem. And I think we kind of distract ourselves that we can multitask, but really we're just doing it at a slower rate and less productive than just focusing on one at a time. And so if we focus, like in terms of the government, focus on one thing at a time, then I think so many things are going to be a lot better on how efficient things are going to be going. And I don't know, like if you're aware about it with the United States, with Doge, there's so many corruption that happens. And when I think about that, I'm like, you know what? It's inevitable that there's going to be a corruption. Fraud. I think part of fraud is like the opportunity and then the motivation. And then if you're actually able to do it, you can get away with it. And I'm just thinking, it's a good thing that we have that in the United States, but like, how about the Philippines? like it's obvious that corruption exists. It's obvious. I mean, in the United States, something really interesting was how, although these politicians, like their salaries are pretty high up there, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, but then like when they retire, they're like $30-40 million more. Like they're going to retire with 30-40 million. It's like the math isn't mathing up here. Like there has to be something, and it happens in the Philippines as well. At the same time, I think we need. It's going to sound really weird. I think we need, like in the Philippines, in terms of politicians, they're just like normal people as well. They're not these lizard people that know better, things like that. They're just normal people that if you were given a bribe, let's just be honest, if you were giving a kickback, for something that people aren't really going to care about per se, and then you're going to like have something for you and your family, I think a
Mhm.
lot of people would actually take that. And having that recognition, recognizing the limitations of government. So now with that, we should recognize like how should we, as much as possible, lower that incentive for that thing to happen. And there's certain nuances in the Philippine government that needs to be addressed. But I think generally speaking, people just need to have pe- people need to vote with that kind of mindset. And I think the United States is actually extremely lucky that their foundations was, from what it looks like, was almost like built with these people of different ideas. And they had their first president, George Washington, who did not want to be a king. Like they had some real altruistic people that is almost, it's a miracle that the way the Constitution was made, the Bill of Rights, and how they had those compromises, and for the idea of having a better society, a better community. It's kind of wild how that even happened. And I think in the Philippines, I mean, the Philippines became a country after it was annexed from Spain,
All right.
and so I don't think it necessarily had that coming together moment. Even in the United States, it fought within itself. There was the Civil War. Like first, it fought off against its parent, and then it started fighting amongst itself like siblings. But then through it, the United States kind of got stronger. There's a bonded experience from people that are living in the East Coast, people from New York City that are Americans. They can like hold hands with people like from California. Like there's a common denomination there. But in the Philippines, it's kind of hard to have that particular culture. It's going to take an exceptional leader to really bridge that gap, especially, I mean, from my understanding in the Philippines, there's also that little bit of a divide between the Christians and maybe the Muslims, and like how they can consider themselves of one country.
Right.
I don't, it's really difficult to kind of go through, to kind of have something like that. And I'm not really aware of anything that combined the two. I mean, the United States, they got into certain wars that kind of bonded them. Like the United States and Japan, right? Like they were fierce enemies, Pearl Harbor, but now they're good allies. The United States and Europe. Um, the United States helps Europe for World War II. And like there's that common Westernness there, but I'm not really sure what it is in the Philippines. Like, what do you think it is that Filipinos can say is very Filipino, like that kind of bonds them together, like apple pie is to America? Like, what do you think that is?
If I'm going to be honest, I really don't know. It's I
Bastos.
think.
I mean, I don't know
Wow.
either. I mean,
I mean, it's hard to determine because, like you said, we and I think it's gonna be even harder
like
because
tinikling maybe.
we see through the lens of how the U.S. came together, and I don't know how the Philippines is going to achieve that. Not to say that it won't, but there's definitely some things that bind us together, or there's a culture that we kind of similarly understand and agree on. But the thing is, like, I think there's still some things in our culture that uh that need changing, or is that isn't still correct. There's a lot of arguments of what Philippine culture is, and even then there's a lot of arguments of what it should and should not be. And so I can't even say that culture is what would bind us together. It's also gonna be hard to say that it's religion, because even within the Christian sect there's so much division among different religions on it.
I mean,
And
the United States had different religions. Like, not
right.
everybody. Like, there was. It's really a miracle in how the founding fathers kind of came to be with their different philosophies, theist like
And I think that's what
ideas.
it should
And
be.
I mean, the Philippines was created in what year?
Who that was? Shoot, I'm not even sure. Officially like a country, like
Yeah.
independent. Oh, it's gonna be a while. It's gonna be a while.
Oh, 1946. Okay.
1946. Yeah.
So
Okay.
really after World War II, the
All right.
Philippines as a country, as an official country, hasn't even been a country for more than 100 years.
And so I think that's one thing that we should like really look at the way that the United States did it. Again, like you said, it's a
It took
miracle.
time. It took
It's
time. It took time, and
right.
it took bloodshed. It took a lot of bloodshed, like
Right.
to get to where we are now. And
And there's the other thing, like is it like it's certainly not going to be the same because the times are moving on. Like we can't necessarily say that war against each other is going to be the way to solve it because war is already a serious matter. We have more advanced tech and there's going to be definitely more bloodshed and more dire consequences if we follow the route of how the United States did it, of how it became a great country, which again really stands by what I
they
really
don't
want to say
need
is like
to. They don't need to follow it, to the T. And just like how China has its own merits, the way
right.
China is, I just think there is. Oh man, this is gonna sound corny, but I think there's a certain level of love that kind of needs to come into play on it, and like particularly the like true love, almost love like Confucius um, had when at the time of exploring the solar systems, um, the church was like the world, the earth was the center of the universe, and but then Confucius being who
Mm,
he is, like him being a religious man, and, and wants to follow a true God, was
right.
searching for truth and found that the sun is the center of our solar system, and because he was searching for truth, like he wanted to appreciate more of God's divine creations, like trying to understand his love, and he got punished for it. But I think there just needs to be like a level of that, and I think the Philippines had it. Like I don't know 100% of what's happening there, but like I almost felt it. I felt it with Duterte when he was president. I was like, well, it's a no-brainer that the president of a country should prioritize its own country over all these other countries. It's a no-brainer, and I
Right.
felt it where I mean, there was that unification, against corruption, and now that he's not president, it's like, was the foundation of the Philippine government, the people, like was that just so built on sand that there was nothing left after he was no longer president? That's kind of sad, and really, do you really deserve like this, a certain system if it couldn't even last that kind of
I, yeah, it's
change of.
interesting when you put that out there because there's definitely a lot of talk about how that system that he created is being eradicated. I think even during his term, I and the way my basis for that is that during his term there were those who were very loyal, who were very supportive of him during the elections, that around midterm people started kind of fade away and started to criticize him because of the way that he was achieving his goals, and the way that he would speak in public, like he would swear in public, and there was definitely the issue of the war
Professionalism.
against drugs. Yeah, like it's a lot of it's a lot of things. And I'm not sure if it kind of shows, like, I think maybe the Philippines isn't ready for that, or maybe we were ready for it but we just didn't have a good understanding of it. There's uh, I try to focus more on what you can do. Like for me, it really doesn't matter. It never really will matter to me what the at this point. It's less important. What's more important that I'd rather people focus on is the things that they could be doing. I tried in a post about healthcare. It's another sob story that wasn't checking all the facts and blaming this corporation and blaming the government. I
Mhm.
tried to correct that by commenting and saying that, there is some personal accountability that needs to be taken place here. There needs to be some understanding that the government isn't all powerful, almighty, and has all kinds of money to spend. There needs to be some understanding that there are limits to some powers and some resources, and that there are some limits to what the government can give you. And the people weren't ready to hear it. I've got criticisms in real life where people came up to me and saying, "Oh, you're being unsympathetic," or "Oh, you
Oh,
sound like you're very
this is
judgy." I'm
emotional
like,
manipulation.
and
Actually,
and that's
actually,
and and it's not that I don't sympathize. It's not that I don't sympathize with the people who are going through this. My main point is essentially, you're going to be living your life instead of focusing on how cruel and what the government cannot provide you and what these private institutions cannot provide you. Focus more on the things that you should be changing, because that is where your real power comes from. There, the government, that the government subsidized healthcare is it's not being allocated properly. That it's government subsidized. For one, if you for my main point was like, don't depend on it. If you know
Mhm.
that the benefits suck, if you know that government healthcare benefits suck, don't depend on it. Don't expect it to give you out of situations. It's sad. I sympathize with people. Like, it's sad that it cannot be, especially with so many Filipinos being in below the poverty or below the average income line or in poverty. It's really sad that they have to depend on it. But that's the reality, is that you cannot rely on it to give you everything that you need. And second of all, there's going to be other solutions. You're gonna have to work harder. You're gonna have to make some sacrifices within your family. You're gonna have to stop drinking, stop smoking, maybe get rid of other vices, maybe be more productive, maybe both parents have to work. Yeah, it's a very sucky situation. But that's the reality of it. Rather than focusing your energy and your time scrolling and rage baiting and saying all these mean things, you ought to be focusing your energy on what you can do, because that's where your real
well,
ability lies.
sorry,
And
I have to do a little bit of a pushback. Sorry, like you continue first.
yeah, and this my main point was basically to just do what you have to do, get the things that you need, and on don't depend on charity work, because
Yep.
there's never a country that got rich through foreign aid. I've seen countries get rich through maximizing their economic outputs and being highly efficient and trading with other countries. Never through foreign aid.
Mm.
All right,
I
your
mean,
pushback?
the pushback on that was you were mentioning, don't waste all their energy and time in social media whining and complaining. I agree to that, but at the same time, there is a level of helpfulness in talking about the issue. I mean, talking about the issue isn't necessarily whining and complaining, and it's
Right,
also it brings it into attention. I mean, like how you found that article about the hospitals was through a Facebook friend, I think, right?
right.
That sent it out. Like, so it's out there. It's a talking point, and I think that is helpful, and that is a very good way for the individual to actually talk about an issue. Now, the problem begins when you start once the ball started rolling. You did need to
Right.
recognize if it is worth continue rolling this ball, because if you put something out there in social media and it's maybe only just you and one other person in this back and forth, and you recognize this other person um, is not really trying to understand your point of view, just recognize that you're at this point you're just wasting your time. Like, that person's not ready to hear your ideas, and potentially you're not willing to hear. You're not ready to hear their ideas. But if there's a group of people looking at that thing, then you got to recognize that you're really not arguing with that other person. You're really showing to everybody else what they are, how your viewpoint is a better viewpoint. Your idea is a better idea, and this is where the gladiatorial combative ideas of like get better. The ideas fight to the death, hopefully to the death, So then the best idea, is alive and and stronger and is ready for the next combatant. And so
Right.
other people can better recognize that. And that's how we educate people more and more, by having their ideas fight. And from there, like, hopefully less physical deaths have to happen. And that's how, we should be doing it all the time.
Right.
You're posting stuff in Facebook and things like that. And I think that's a good thing. It helps bring attention to certain things. And to be honest, it's also risky, because I think, the majority of people would actually not say anything. But for there to be change and for there to be truth, people need to be willing to even collaborate or communicate and be part of that. And sometimes
Right.
having a unpopular opinion could have a negative consequence for you in the real world. And that's the kind of boldness that is sometimes required. I applaud the people that was, talking about COVID and how where it would originally come from. And some people got blasted for it. It's part of it is like, to open your mouth is to potentially offend others, and also to be
Right.
potentially shamed from others. And so there's the price of speech, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm hoping
I
that ideas is how we're gonna better improve the world. And like, the best way to do it is just on a free platform. And hopefully, as you maintain, like, as you live a good life, let's say, then more people can kind of look back into your posts and things like that, and then better recognize what is true and what's not.
I think that I'm very optimistic. Like, honestly, there was a post on Reddit that says the Philippines this is why the Philippines is hopeless. And I commented, I wanted to comment on that and say, I really hope not. I don't think the Philippines is hopeless. I am very optimistic for the future of the future generation, and even in this generation, I am very optimistic that things are going to turn around. It's going to take some courage and sacrifice on our part, and it's going to require a lot of effort and even some resources of time and money, and
Mhm.
even it requires you to get some knowledge and gain some wisdom. But I'm very, like, honestly, I'm very optimistic. I think that there are things that are yet to come,
Mhm.
and we should at the very least we shouldn't give up hope.
Yeah.
But look to the future with faith and with optimism.
All right. So we got to put our money where our mouths are. All right. I expect you to be investing in the ETF for Filipinos, the Philippine ETF.
Smart, there's more smart and in smart ways to do it, okay. One step at a time, baby steps. All right, that's all on our end, and that's the pod. It was a great. See you guys next week.
Ciao.